There are a lot of heroes on the Marvel Rivals roster, but you know what? There could be more. And in this video, we're going to go through some of the heroes that I think could make it to the Marvel Rivals roster eventually from its sister Marvel game, Marvel Snap. If we're going to start anywhere, we've got to start with Gambit. Gambit makes perfect sense for Marvel Rivals. Think about it. With his ranged attack, his left click could be literally throwing his explosive cards. That is perfect. Maybe you can interact with the environment a little bit. Maybe his right click, he'll take debris and he'll kind of power it up and throw it across the battlefield for larger explosions. And maybe his ultimate, he can actually do an area of effect where he basically buffs all of your teammates' left clicks to do AoE burst damage. So like they're all like little exploding projectiles. I think that Gambit could be really cool in Marvel Rivals, and of course, he's absolutely beloved in the Marvel universe as a whole, so I would love to see him in the game, and I think it makes perfect sense. I think there could be potentially a lot of interesting design space around Rogue, and while I do think that Rogue and Captain Marvel have to be in the game eventually and could have very similar kits, the way I envision Rogue I think is a little more nuanced. I could see Rogue kind of like being a flying dive bomb style tank that gets in there and her left click does damage with her fist, and everything that she damages actually disables their abilities for a set period of time. I think that could be really interesting. Her right click could be something that where like she'll grab and physically displace an opponent, right? And maybe her ultimate is she just like ground pounds and does like a stun or something like that. But what I will say though is that I do think that Rogue could potentially be a very interesting hero in Marvel Rivals, especially with like a flying tank side to it, which I think is a really neat hybrid. Another absolute banger for those that have been watching the X-Men in '97 series is going to be Bishop. It's kind of interesting to think that like you don't have that many like gun characters in this particular game, and I think that Bishop could serve one of those spots. His rifle could be like a pulse style rifle, different than that of something like the Punisher, but where I think he really shines is his ability to like absorb energy, which is what he does in the comics and in the lore itself. And let's say you have a meter in his ultimate that charges as opponents use their abilities. As they use their abilities, Bishop charges, and then finally he's able with his fist to just let go of this like Kamehameha style blast and just blowing up your opposing team for a couple seconds or whatever it is, like just laser beams coming out of his hands. Now maybe that's overpowered, I don't know, it sounds pretty awesome, but I do think that Bishop's playstyle could fit really well into Marvel Rivals. Next up, we're going to be going to the Avengers with Black Widow, and there's some suggestions and murmurs out there that Black Widow has been being teased by the Rivals team in advance of the launch, and I would absolutely love to see Black Widow in the game. I would suspect she would be best as a melee support. The reason for this is I think that she can do a lot of things in melee range. I think she's naturally kind of like a kung fu specialist. Not okay, I know she doesn't do kung fu, but I think that she could have a skill set where she like can immobilize enemies with her Widow's Bite. I think she could have a really interesting toolkit, and while she's not a superhero per se, I think that from a support role, she could potentially do a lot of interesting things. If we're going to stick to the MCU, I'm going to make an argument for Ultron being a hero that I think could make it into Marvel Rivals, and obviously it's an absolute fantastic card in Marvel Snap, but what it does there is it spawns tons of drones. And I was thinking to myself, how would I play Ultron in Marvel Rivals? And I think it could be a very interesting dive tank. Like he's a tank, takes lots of damage, stuff like that, but then he gets into the enemy lines, and maybe his ultimate, he actually brings out tons of drones, or drones drop from the sky and just swarm onto your opponents, and if they don't have the AoE damage to compensate for it, they can actually overrun positions and areas and domination and stuff like that. So I do think that as like a dive tank, Ultron with his summons could be potentially very interesting, and I think it's just a fascinating character as a whole for Marvel Rivals to consider adding to the game. In keeping with the idea of tanks, I do think that it's worth noting that Wolverine is a hero that has a tremendous amount of regenerative abilities, and I think that could be something a little advantageous for him. If you think about what he could do as like a melee tank, he kind of gets into enemy lines, does sweeping damage with his claws, but also if he gets taken down, maybe his passive is something along the lines of like, he actually never quite dies. Maybe he goes and takes a knee for a second, he regenerates and then pops back up. While he's doing that, he won't count for like, being on point, because well, that would be super cheap. But I do think it would be very interesting to have a hero with like a built-in presence of like, okay, he's knocked down, but he's going to get up shortly as he regenerates. I think Wolverine could potentially be a very fascinating choice, and obviously an iconic hero in the Marvel franchise. I had this thought that I think that Wasp, hear me out, Wasp would be a really cool addition to Marvel Rivals as a flying support. I think that, like, if you think about what like the PIM technologies do, I think you can have like a healing PIM grenade or something like that. I think you can also have an ability where you hit your allies with a PIM particle and like they'll get larger and get bonus HP, bonus hitbox, bonus armor, and kind of like turn into a mega tank. Imagine like the Hulk turned into a monstrosity with a PIM particle. Like, I think that could be really interesting. Obviously flying around as well. Now I was thinking about an ultimate. You know what would be a really cool ultimate for something like the Wasp? What if she became super small but still counted for being on the point, and her hitbox actually shrank and opponents had to actually snipe the Wasp out of the air? Maybe she had a reduction in her HP, but I think that would be really fascinating because like the hero may be buzzing around, you could see her, but you'd have to be able to snipe her out of the sky. I think that's just kind of interesting. We've got a lot of popular heroes I still want to talk about, but you know what? I want to go into some deep cuts as well. And I think we start with Iceman. Iceman, I mean, obviously it's not that deep of a cut, but Iceman could be potentially a really interesting support. Think about his toolkit. I think that he could be like slowing your enemies and stuff like that. I think his ultimate or even his right click could potentially be something like setting up freezing fields where, you know, your enemies will like slip and slide on the surface of battle and they won't be able to gain traction, and they'll kind of just have like this wish-washy momentum where they're just sliding all over the place. I think it could be potentially very disruptive, and as a support, I think his toolkit might be very interesting. So I wouldn't sleep on Iceman as potentially being a character that could make it into Marvel Rivals eventually. Alright, so this one's going to be a little silly, but what about Goose? Goose is one of my favorite characters in the Marvel Universe, and I think it could be potentially interesting as like a DPS or even a support or something like that. Because if you think about it, like, I'm not saying you want to just like have Goose throwing treats or something ridiculous, but its ability to just devour the opposing team, and maybe that's a little OP. Maybe you have Goose like just straight up trade an enemy as its ultimate. So like, you know, you hit your ultimate and it just takes an enemy and just eats it. And you just one for one trade it, and you're up and they're gone, and your ultimate's now on cooldown. That could potentially be very interesting. Might be overpowered. I don't know what a Goose toolkit would look like, but if you're going to have Jeff the baby land shark in the game, why not have a kitty? Now, while I know that Goose is a little far-fetched, I do think that Green Goblin stands a pretty good chance of making it into Marvel Rivals. Think about it, his kit is awesome. He'd be throwing like pumpkin grenades and stuff like that, doing AoE damage with his left click. You could also do something like a really interesting ultimate, where he uses his hoverboard and he like launches, he kicks off it, launches the hoverboard, and he hits enemies along the way and sticks them into the environment where like they're kind of helpless, and then the hoverboard like explodes after doing damage. I think that could be potentially interesting. You know, you have this like displacement effect with some damage as well, and in the meantime he's running around throwing bombs or whatever he's doing until the hoverboard regenerates. I think it could be a fascinating hero in Marvel Rivals. Talking about hybrids, tanks are not often mobile, but I do think that Dr. Octopus could be a very interesting design for a tank. Make him really tanky. I think his auto attack can be similar to like Venom's, where he uses like his arms to attack, but I think he should be very good at traversing the environment using his octopus legs. I think that could be like kind of like his niche, a very highly mobile tank. Well, we kind of have that, but I think that he'd be really interesting at it as well. In terms of his ultimate, I think that he'd be a really cool displacement hero, a disruption hero, or perhaps with all of his like limbs, he kind of reaches out and he grabs opposing heroes and sucks them in like a black hole. That could be potentially great for like team fighting and like synergy with other ultimates. Maybe you pull them all in and then Jeff scoops them all up or whatever, right? You could do some really interesting things with an ultimate like that. It would be like a great team fighting thing, and so for that reason, I think that Dr. Octopus should be considered as a hero in Marvel Rivals. Alright, now we're gonna do some quick shoutouts here, okay? I gotta say, Vision's gotta be in there eventually. Obviously, be able to go through walls and stuff like that would be really interesting. I don't know if he uses the Mind Stone to do some work as well. I think he could be potentially very interesting. Captain Marvel, I mentioned before, could be potentially a hero that would probably have a kit similar to that of Rogue, but like honestly a super iconic hero that would have to be there. What about Cyclops? I mean, Cyclops, obviously you lean into like, oh, he's gotta have the I-beam stuff eventually, like it's gotta have something to do with the I-beam stuff, but at least give him like a moonwalk when he gets a victory pose or something, you know what I mean? We gotta do something for Cyclops. Let's move X-Men, get him into the game. And then finally, a hero that I think could really be legit in this game is Destroyer. Think about Destroyer, right? Massive tank, really cool ability, essentially kind of like Cyclops shooting massive laser beam type things. I think the Destroyer could be fascinating, and I think it could be a very interesting addition to Marvel Rivals, and it just goes to show you how wide the Marvel Universe is, and just kind of like the breadth of heroes that could be added to this game over time. So I am beyond excited for Marvel Rivals, so thank you so much for watching, guys. Subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and we'll see you on that next one.